Welcome, Nathan. Over to you.
Hello. And can you
Hi.
see my screen?
I can.
Yes, good. I'm one of those who can't see chat, by the way, so I'm
Okay.
happy for people to ask questions as we're going through, or Rachel can pick out things from the Menti at the
Okay.
end. Okay, so this little talk today is in a way a companion piece to one that Neil Wilson, late of this parish, gave before Christmas. He was a maths professor at the University of Manchester. He's now moved on to Durham. But with some other people at the Trust at Manchester, and Kevin Wong, the A&E space doctor, and some mathematicians at the university, he looked at what queuing theory had to say about the priorities in different bed pools across the hospital at Manchester in order to try to hit the maximum waiting times for outpatients. And he was looking at a quite simple queuing model. And the queuing model had this mathematical characteristic, the blue line, that it shows the probability that any individual patient will wait longer than a particular time t. So he was looking at, okay, if your breach limit is 52 weeks, you have to admit someone within 52 weeks, and you'll only accept 2% of them waiting 52 weeks or longer, then what does that mean in terms of the average waiting time? It has to be about a quarter of that target time. So these queuing systems, because of variation, they have this characteristic curve shape with a very long tail, which means that if you're particularly worried about these tail risks, then you have to be operating a long way away from them most of the time. So there's this exponential curve we see a lot. And this is driven by the amount of variation there is in the system. So the variation in the rates at which patients join the waiting list in this case, and the length of stay of the ones you've admitted. And that variation is really important. That is, though, hidden inside most of the queuing models. So what I'm intending to talk about today is those sort of extra insights you can get from the very simple queuing mathematics about things like the impact of variation on your systems and things like bed pooling. So pooling different bed pools together to make a bigger pool. Mathematically what that does, and then a few thoughts about, well, actually, do we get that in reality? So we're talking about queuing systems, which we broadly characterize like this. So customers, patients, even the prison service talks about some of their inmates as customers now. We're doing things like lean, etc. So customers, patients approach the system, and then they might join our system. They might enter the queue to wait for a service. So the service might be cubicles, or often we think about beds. So we've got a bunch of beds in a pool, taking patients who are waiting from the waiting list, or they might be on trolleys in A&E or something. They are waiting for a bed to become free. And in some cases, we might model situations where actually the patient doesn't join a queue, is maybe not allowed to queue. So they might be transferred to another hospital, or they might have to go as an outlier to another ward. So we can incorporate those sorts of things in our models. Really important are things like the number of servers, M, or sometimes we call it S, which is basically the number of beds or trolleys or people or whatever, and the variation in the arrival times and the service times. So the service times, for example, we're thinking about the length of stay in a bed. Length of stay, not lost. Length of stay, it's a time, continuous time measure. And then for the arrivals, we might be thinking about it in terms of the time between patients arriving, being referred, whatever. Or we might be thinking about the number in a time slice, the number per day, per week, per month. They're equivalent ways of thinking about the system. So that's what we mean by a simple queuing system. And the sorts of things that we often look to measure as metrics to see how our system's performing are things like how it behaves from the patient's point of view, how long they might be waiting on average in the queue, how long that queue might be, how many trolleys, how many patients on trolleys there might be on average. the risk that all the servers are busy so that they can't go straight to a bed or a cubicle when they need one, or the risk that if a queue has a maximum size or you can't queue at all, that actually they won't be able to come in, they'll have to go somewhere else. So we think about those sorts of metrics that the maths will give us pretty quickly. And then from the organization's point of view, we might be thinking about how busy are the servers. So we might be, in beds terms, thinking about occupancy. So we're interested in metrics like that. And for simple systems like this, if we make lots of assumptions, we can get to some numbers for this quite quickly. But more importantly, we can see the impact, the sort of scale and direction of the impact if we vary the number of beds, if we in particular think about changing the variations. We can do think about the variation there. What would that do to our performance? So when it comes to actually trying to get some numbers to look at the impact of cause and effect, there's several ways to go with modeling these systems. So the quick way that I'm going to focus on today is the analytical, the mathematical way, where you can pick out some sets of equations and feed in some numbers, and that will pop some answers. But of course, to be able to write down the maths and solve the maths, you need lots and lots of assumptions about what's going on in this system. One in particular is the system is in steady state, which means that on average, the queue is not getting longer or shorter. In practice, of course, it's going to be bouncing around a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, but on average, it's not transient. It's not a system that started empty and is warming up, that it's already reached that steady state, because the numbers we get out are long run averages. So the long run average expected waiting time, for example. So that's the maths route. And then deeper into it, the simplest queuing models that I'll talk about to start with and are behind the modeling that Neil did. These are called Markov models technically. We make very specific assumptions about the shape of the arrival and service uncertainty, the probability distributions basically. They give us exact solutions, numbers that pop out of equations. You can relax them a bit to get some really useful, powerful, general equations that allow us to think about, well, what if the distribution was different? What if it had less variation or even more variation? What would it do? But now we're in approximate territory. So still it's good enough for some insights, some first cut rapid numbers. If you've got complexity in your system, it's not steady state, we've got complicated interactions and rules and logic in here, for example, then the next step is to actually build a computer simulation, to put the logic in software and run it forward through time and see what happens. So it's much more flexible, but it requires skills and lots of time. It's very labor intensive. You can build, again, fairly simple simulation models with spreadsheets, where particularly just time slicing. You're simulating what happened one day and then follow through to the next day and the next day and so on. The more advanced continuous time approach, where you can actually look at real interactions between individual patients and individual servers and include resources like clinicians and all sorts of things, it's called discrete event simulation. And we do some of that with specialist software. Again, you need skills, it can be expensive. You can do some of this stuff with coding, but it's very laborious. So I'm looking today in particular how much you can do quickly with mathematical equations. This is in reserve. There's a lot of stuff written, particularly in the academic literature, about simulation of hospitals and A&Es and that sort of stuff. But most of it is done by people who are more interested in simulation or getting their PhD or something than actually making much of a difference. So some of it has been pretty useful, but a lot of it maybe becomes complicated toys in a box for academic purposes. So the starting point for a lot of this, and this 85% number, comes from a paper that was produced by Adrian Bagust and co. He's a epidemiological professor at Liverpool, and it got published in the BMJ. So it had a pretty wide reach. What he did is model a large medical bed pool with random arrivals and random length of stays. And he built a spreadsheet simulation model. And he looked at what happens when the system gets busier. So, for example, the arrival rates go up, patients, or you have fewer beds. So again, the utilization goes up, you've got less resource, and you get these characteristic queuing performance curves. So as the system gets busier, of course, the risk of a poor outcome, which might be all the beds being full, the red line, or a crisis day, the waits become long. It has this, again, exponential shape, and as you get close to 100%, of course, it starts shooting up to infinity. So it asymptotes to 100%. So you see this with all of these sorts of models. And because it's a simulation, he's run it lots of times, you get this scatter of points. In maths, we have a smooth curve through this. But this was a simulation model. So he built this model and got these results, and then went to data on NHS occupancy, and it was about 97%. So saying, well, yes, of course, if you're running at 97% occupancy, then the risk of having no beds, the risk of a bed crisis is pretty high, unsurprisingly. And then went to get some US data and saw, oh, they're working at about 85%. So it's not surprising that their systems are much better from that point of view. So a message that Department of Health took, and then some trusts wrote into policy documents, was occupancy must be 85%. Some of them even said 85% across all of the bed pools separately. So every bed pool must run at 85%, or 82 or 84, there were various numbers. So the question is, does that make sense? And the answer is, to cut to the end, the answer is no. And part of the reason was that some of the context was lost, that he was modeling large pools, 200 maybe beds, and these were medical inpatients, just medical inpatients he was looking at. And also, you shouldn't really be thinking about utilization as an input, as a driver. It's the performance you need to think about. So a consequence was things like, we've done lots of work with bed managers over the decades, and we were doing a lot back then around this time. One of the Manchester hospitals came and said, well, we notice in pediatrics that we are running at only 54% occupancy. And apparently Department of Health says everyone should run at 85. So if we increase our occupancy to 85%, then how many beds could we shut? And save some hard green dollars, redeploy the nurses, etc. So they had a bed pool of 34 beds that was with the demand they were facing, giving them 54% occupancy. So do a quick back of the envelope calculation and say, okay, with your length of stays and with your demand rates, then if you only had 22 beds, then you'd be running at 85% on average. So close 12 beds. But is that a sensible idea? So I thought, right, this is a queuing theory type situation. Let's get some data from them on average length of stay and average referral rates, and stick them in the equations and draw the performance curve for this particular system. And you end up saying that, well, if you are running at 85%, then the consequences would be a third of the time when a child needs a bed, the beds are all full. We obviously can't outlie a child in an adult bed. We don't want to transfer them to another hospital. This really is pretty risky. And it's the wrong way of thinking about things. So instead, think about, well, what is an acceptable level of performance? So I went and looked at national data on pediatrics, and it seemed that people were running their bed pools at an access block risk rate of about 1 in 1,000. This was some time ago. I don't know if they still are. So thinking about it the other way, your performance is on the y-axis. This is where you should start. What level of performance are we prepared to accept? And read across the curve and the consequence would be you should be running at an average of about 54% to give you that level of performance. You need your 34-ish beds to protect you against the random busy times when you might have a lot of referrals, you might have some long length of stays. So it's not that you are wasting 12 beds or even more, they are there as protective capacity. So these equations, these queuing equations, with simple assumptions, give you a pretty quick idea of just how big an impact might it have and in what direction. So the message is occupancy is, number one, not a target, and certainly not a target to apply to all bed pools because they have different characteristics. And what you should be thinking about is to reach a certain level of performance, what average occupancy would the consequence be in order to absorb the variation in our system. So that was a quick, harsh introduction to the effect of this message, superficial message of 85%. So modeling in a bit more detail or a bit higher resolution and switching from Excel to R, then the curve I drew before is this dark blue one. So we can see what the actual number is. And this was a model where patients would be waiting, which we didn't want to happen. What's the risk of them waiting? You can model other scenarios, and there's a model called the patient transferred model, where you would say that instead of a patient hanging around until they did get a bed, they would straight away go somewhere else. So actually those patients disappear, they're lost from the system. So you actually get better performance because someone else is actually having to deal with them. So there are different systems you can model. This is the lost model. It's actually lost, comes from modeling lost telephone calls. There's a guy called Erlang over 100 years ago, a Danish mathematician, kicked queuing theory off by modeling the Danish, or the Copenhagen telephone exchange. So this model is where a caller would wait until the operator was free to connect to them, but another model where they would just give up straight away if the operator was busy. So you can model different scenarios like that. One of the big assumptions behind those simple models is, yep, steady state, mentioned that. It's not going to be busier or quieter on average. But the other one is about the nature of the variation, the nature of the randomness. And it's this Markovian thing. What that means is that the actual number of patient arrivals, for example, in a time period would be drawn from a Poisson distribution, something that gives you an integer between 0 and infinity, and it's got a long right tail. Okay, this is fairly symmetrical, but they've all got a longer right tail because they can go off to infinity. There's a small chance of a very high number of arrivals. Similarly, for the number of services you could do, your capacity, the maximum number of services you could theoretically do in a time period, that also is drawn from a Poisson. And mathematically, that's the same thing as if you think about real time, think about the actual length of stay, for example. Instead of thinking about the number of patients you could get through your beds in a time period, you're thinking about how long might a length of stay be. So this green curve here is the exponential distribution that fits with this Poisson. So these are the probability distribution that the length of stay is some particular period. They fit together in the maths. But these are hidden inside the simple queuing models. To make the maths work, this assumption is made. The maths works out quite easily. So question, of course, is how well do they fit? So again, getting some data, this is from urology. We've got a histogram in gray for the actual number of admissions in a time period today. And that has a mean of about 5.65 admissions per day. The red line is a fitted distribution, a Poisson, with that same mean. And it's not terrible, but it's not great. And in fact, the real distribution is wider. It's got a bigger spread. It's got more variation. It's more uncertain than this standard Poisson. We can do the same thing for the length of stays, again in urology, with the actual length of stays in gray and then a fitted exponential, because we're in the real-time world here. So both of them have got the average of 4.25. So visually we can say, well, fits a bit, but it's not great. And again, the distribution of the real data is wider. We've got some long length of stays out here. And we can, of course, do stats and maths to say just how good or bad is that length is that goodness of fit? How well does it fit? But we can see that the variation doesn't fit the models that well. And also it's inflexible because the models make that assumption and stick with that assumption. This is the only slide of maths, but there's plenty more equations in the appendix of the paper if anyone's really interested in the maths. The very simple models that we've been looking at so far and behind the Neil Wilson stuff and the pediatrics model says that the expected waiting time for a patient is something to do with the utilization. This thing here, rho, is the utilization, and the service time. This thing 1 on mu is actually, it's the average service rate. And once you do 1 over the average service rate, you get the average length of stay. So basically that's the average length of stay. So utilization times that actual average length of stay gives you the expected waiting time. There's nothing in there about the variation. It's implicit because it's making those assumptions. But it does give us a quick and simple exact answer. We can relax those assumptions to say, well, the arrivals might be any old distribution, and the services, the length of stays, might be any old distribution as well, by putting in this term here, a variation term. So the other terms are the same, something to do with utilization, something to do with the service time. So now we've got the coefficient of variation. You remember, maybe, coefficient of variation is the standard deviation divided by the mean, like the relative spread of the distribution, how spread it is relative to the mean, the spreadedness. And this is the coefficient of variation of the arrivals, and this is the services. And the system we were looking at before, the simple one, the Markovian, that's behind most simple queuing theory, it has the characteristic that the exponential distribution, the standard deviation, is the same as the mean. So the coefficient of variation is 1. This whole thing is 1 squared plus 1 squared over 2. So this whole thing is 1. So the V implicit in the basic queuing models is the standard benchmark amount of variation of 1. But these models here allow us to say, well, what if there's more or less variation? And in particular, what happens as the variation heads down towards 0? You think you head down towards a clockwork system, then what happens to V? The standard deviations get heading down towards 0. So that's heading towards 0, that's heading towards 0. This whole term is heading to 0. So you can have weights that are heading to 0, even if the utilization is very high. So if you think about that curve had before, pediatrics looked like that. This was the utilization. This was the waiting time. If you had a clockwork system where you had exactly 1 hour between patients and it took 1 hour to treat each patient, you could run at 100% utilization and still have no weights. The V was 0. And then as soon, of course, as they started arriving anything faster than once an hour, you'd be shooting off to infinity. So with no variation, you can run a system like this. But the bigger the variation, the quicker this curve starts heading upwards. It starts at 0, but it starts heading off to infinity quicker. So we can explicitly see the impact of the variation there, as well as of the utilization and the average length of stay. The one at the bottom is even more flexible because it allows us to explicitly say how many servers are there, for example, how many beds are there that are taking patients from this queue, from A&E, for example. So it's also got the S in there, the number of servers, number of beds. So we can say what would happen if we contrast, for example, contrast 3 little bed pools with 1 big bed pool that takes all of those patients. What would that do? But again, we've got this really useful insight, the but relationship, that the performance of the system, its delay or its risk of all the beds being full or the length of the queue, whatever, is something to do with the variation in the arrivals and the services, multiplied by something to do with the utilization and the number of beds and the average length of stay. So anything you can do to reduce the variation is going to have a big impact. Think about that going down to 0. Reducing the utilization, of course, makes things better, and reducing the average length of stay. But this is going to cost you a lot of money. This, we're always trying to do that. This one gives us maybe a bit of extra magic. If with the same patient load and average length of stay and beds, we could reduce the variation in the distribution, we could improve things a lot. And the equations give you an insight into just how much that would be. For example, this is from the paper, applying that same relationship, that VUT formula, to a bunch of data from bed pools in a Dutch hospital, then you can draw the characteristic queuing performance curve for each of those separate bed pools. Of course, they all look different. They've all got their own performance curve because they've got their own admission rates and length of stays and numbers of beds, and in particular, their own variation around the length of stay and around the arrival rates. So plot it for all of these different units, and actually the circles show what actual average utilization they were working at. So this is looking like the coronary care unit's looking like the most dangerous one at the moment. So you can see that for the same level of risk of all the beds being full, for example, 5%, then different bed pools need to be working at different utilizations, therefore have different numbers of empty beds on average some of the time. I've also plotted on there the curve from Bagust's paper, the BMJ, and you'll see that actually it's much better than any of these others. And big reason there is that he was looking at big bed pools. He was looking at basically all the medical pools in a hospital put together. So he's looking at 200 plus beds, 200 plus servers in the model. And they were all medical inpatients. So the Bagust stuff about saying, well, if you were running at 85% here, your risk would be only this, is actually not borne out for all of these other, all of these actual bed pools. They'd be running at much higher risks. This one, if you run it at 85%, would be running full, or be full nearly 80% of the time. Okay, so the 85% doesn't apply to all of these. But what can you do about it? What can we use our equations for to see the impacts of variation, utilization, numbers of servers, and the service duration, the average length of stay? So you could take the nature of your system, the V, variation, and the average length of stay as given, and then just operate with this in the middle, the utilization and number of beds bit. That's what we were doing with the pediatrics, saying that, okay, you've got 34 beds. What if you cut down to 22? You're thinking about sliding up and down the curve. You're accepting the performance curve you've got here, the nature of the system, and you are just making the trade-offs between having more beds versus longer waits, sliding up and down that curve. The real power and interest of this is saying, well, what if you actually changed the nature of the system, the design of the system, so you moved the curve, you changed the trade-off? So here are, from the Dutch data again, here are the 3 coronary care bed pools, and this is just a what if. The reality, of course, there are all sorts of other things going on. What if instead of having 3 separate bed pools that you run independently, you pool the beds, you combine them into one bed pool? So the 3 special units, the 3 separate units are the red, green, and blue. Those are their performance curves. If you fed all of the same demand and the same length of stays, etc., into one combined pool, so all the beds were now run as one bed pool, you'd have a system that performed like the purple curve. And that is the aggregate utilization. It'd be running at that aggregate utilization, and it would have this performance curve. So again, you can see for the same beds, the same resource, you've got much better performance. So mathematically, pooling the beds has a big impact on performance. It's doing the same work, so the same overall utilization, but the waiting time, the risk of all beds being full is much, much better. So we can see that mathematically. And this really is the idea of carve out pooling and then maybe onto segmentation. So we call it carve out when you've got a capacity, a number of beds, for example, and you split them up. So you essentially ring fence them. You've got a wall in between them so that when one happens to be busy, randomness, and one quiet, they can't help each other. So you have the separate curves basically for the separate bed pools. The math stuff says, well, if you pool them, like that previous graph, you work with a much bigger bed pool, like Bagust working with whatever, 200 beds, you get much, much better performance if you take away the wall. So this was another message actually that the Department of Health took from that BMJ paper, and several trusts went for the approach where the bed manager now had access to all of the beds. So any patients, it was their responsibility to find a bed for them anywhere in the hospital. Mathematically, that is much, much better. But what actually happened in some trusts? Did it go smoothly? Well, again, we're working with bed managers, and in many cases, it didn't. Because again, it ignores other things about the system. It ignores lots of behavioral and human stuff. So for example, patients were being sent as outliers around big hospitals, and doctors were maybe physically unable to get to see them on one ward round. Patients were being missed, so length of stays were going up. Also, it ceased to be the management responsibility of a specialism to manage their own beds. For example, to make sure they were going to discharge enough patients to get the electives in they wanted. It became the bed manager's problem to find it somewhere else. So they were no longer, the expression was, consuming our own smoke. So hospitals went back from that, went back to saying, these are your beds, you manage them, you consume your own smoke. So you have to be careful thinking about pooling. What's that going to do? How's it going to be managed? How will people react? The maths tells us it'd be great, but of course these are human systems we're working with. Splitting up capacity might not be a bad thing. If you're doing it and it is a bad thing, we call it carve out. You're artificially splitting it up so they can't help each other and you're not getting any benefits back. Pooling can be a good thing mathematically, but how will people react? The other term we use is segmentation. This is when you realize there are segments in the patients who need something fundamentally different, and you can design pathways for them to much more efficiently serve those needs than if any old person was serving any old patient. So minors and majors in A&E, for example. Some trusts did some really good work, some of it got overwhelmed, but some really good work in saying, well, what really matters about, for example, medical admissions is how sick they are. That some of them are just not very sick, they're not going to be here for long. We want them in a short stay environment where any doctor will see them but quickly, and we'll get them out in 2 days, maximum 4 days. We don't want them getting sucked into the specialist care pools where the doctors don't come around very often and they're doing research projects on them and that sort of thing. So they segmented the flows by the expected length of stay. That can be very efficient. So there are many things to think about in how you manage your capacity and whether you split it up or whether you pool it. But one consideration is if you are carving it out, if you are splitting it up, for example, reserving some beds for urgent patients who might come along as protective capacity, is there some way of increasing the flexibility of that? Of saying, well, it's getting close to the time, it looks like we won't need that many beds, things have been quiet, can we pull in some patients off a short notice list to use that capacity so it doesn't expire, it doesn't get wasted in the end? So some flexibility around that to reduce the harmful effects of carve out. So talked about bed pooling, changing the S in the equations. Something I'm particularly interested in is thinking about variation. And in fact, this is behind, as I said, behind lean production and Six Sigma, all that sort of stuff. It's saying, if we've got a system with that much variation, what if we could squeeze the variation down to that? What would it do? So operating on the V term in here, and actually saw that the urology data had wider variation than the standard queuing models assume. V was bigger than 1 in urology, and it's actually bigger in quite a lot of our systems. So the actual urology system, I think this was urology, was operating like this red curve. So high variation quite rapidly, well before 85%, the average waiting time is shooting upwards towards infinity. If you could reduce the variation, for example, down to that benchmark level of 1 that's assumed in the models, you'd be operating as the green system. So the waits at the same utilization, same bed, same number of patients, the waits would be much shorter. That's making the arrivals down to the benchmark. If you can make both of them down to the benchmark, so big V is 1, you'd be working at the blue curve. And then if you could halve it again, you'd be down to the purple. So we're seeing dramatic improvements in performance if we can reduce the variation in arrivals and in service times, length of stay, for example. And said ultimately the clockwork system goes along the wait is 0 axis until it hits 100%. And that's what they are dreaming of and aiming for in many production systems. Leveling the demand, leveling the flow. So what we've been talking about is queuing systems, and simple queuing systems give us some nice curves very quickly that we can get some numbers from and some quick insights about the trade-offs. We've been thinking in particular about, well, what other insights are there? In particular, the design of the system, like how much bed pooling there is and how much variation is there in the system. What does that do to actually where this trade-off is? By changing the design, the variation, you can shift the curve, you can shift the trade-off. So for the same resources, you get better performance. So those sorts of considerations are really important, and these models can quickly show you just the size of the impact there. So that really is the central message from this, that the characteristics of the system drive its performance, and that this 85% doesn't fit all characteristics, of course. It's a nice benchmark figure, and it's often talked about in operations management, but some systems are much more clockwork than that. For example, knee surgery, booking the patients in, they're all in for the same sort of thing, they won't be staying very long. You can run at much higher occupancies than that, whereas something like ICU, pediatrics needs much lower. So the opposite case actually from the pediatrics, we were at an exemplar trust event being held at Warwick, where a lot of the best trusts have been brought together by NHS Institute or somebody. And one of these trusts presented their plans to bring down occupancy in their orthopedic system from 95% down to the magic 85. But again, would that have been sensible? Actually, the answer is no. They were working quite happily at 95%, because it was a pretty good clockwork system, low variation. There's nothing magic about 85%. It's a consequence of the design of the system. It's not a magic input to all systems. So these queuing theory models give you a first cut to the results. They allow you to draw these curves and make some inferences, see some insights from it. They do make lots of assumptions. I'd be very wary of taking predictive being predictive about the numbers that come out. But the insights are very good. And in particular, this VUT relationship, that you can shift the trade-off. Instead of saying, well, do we need more beds to slide down the curve, or can we have fewer beds and we'd be sliding up the curve on the trade-off, to actually shift the trade-off by thinking about what amount of pooling is sensible, and in particular, what can we do to reduce the variation? Bearing in mind always, of course, there's humans in the system. How will people behave? And if we think there could be, or we find there is some dysfunctional behavior stimulated by our system, what can we do to reduce that? But the big thing for me, the big takeaway is all about the impact of variation. And then that would take you on to thinking about how. So that's the bit over to you. In your systems, what can be done to reduce the variation? In queuing terms, the variation in the arrivals and the variation in the services. So that's the end of what I was going to say. There are some references. So these papers here, including Neil Wilson and Kevin Fong's paper, these are all available to you, and the original Adrian Bagust paper from the BNJ. So that's the end of what I wanted to say. Over to you if there's any questions that I can answer. I'm not very good at thinking on my feet, so some of these questions I might want to take away and think about, but which I'm very happy to do.
Thank you, Nathan. That was fascinating. Thank you very much for your time and preparing that for us. So let me see, do we have any questions? You've got lots of hearts and lots of applause going on there. So let's just enjoy that moment for a second or two before I look see if we have any questions. There's a couple of questions. So I'll share my screen and you can read the ones which are there and decide whether or not it's something that you want to ponder or something you want to dive into and respond.
And by the way, my email was on the first one, but you can have these slides, and Rachel can pass on my email. If any questions occur to you after this, or you want to follow anything up, then
brilliant. Thank you very much. That's very kind. That's very generous. Right, let me do what I said I was going to do, which is find the right screen. And then I will just share the screen with a couple of points that were made earlier on in your presentation. So you might have picked up on these already. Can you see them?
Yeah. So the first one is, yes, it's very dodgy, of course, thinking about a bed as a server, as a productive unit of resource. It assumes, yes, it's staffed and people are getting patients moved on. We often, in push systems in the NHS, use beds as somewhere to store patients, and the delayed discharges times are really quite shocking. A patient ready to go home, but they're still there in the bed. Mm-hmm. The flexing stuff, then that would be really nice. And yes, there has been historically some flexing in winters, for example, and some beds that can be opened, and maybe 5-day beds turn into 7-day beds now and again. Mm-hmm. There's a limit to what we can do physically, but also with staff. In the States, of course, they have this much easier. Some hospitals have staff that are on they're on flexible contracts. They're on not quite 0 hours, but it's easy to bring in staff. So I've heard that they have wards, they have operating theatres that are there idle. If they need the staff, they can pull them in. So they've got that flexibility we don't have for a number of reasons. Okay. But yeah, we're assuming we've got this capacity. There was a great project in the 80s where the Department of Health paid the Met Office to forecast how many patients might be turning up at A&E based on the weather and so on. And that's a great idea, but of course it runs into the wall. You can't flex your A&E very much. You can't suddenly get more A&E doctors and more cubicles if they say, well, it's icy and there's going to be more fractures tomorrow. Yeah. So you always have to have something to do with any predictions for it to be worthwhile doing.
Absolutely.
Yes, occupancy one point of the week. Is it still midnight on Thursday? That was the tradition. So yes, we did a lot of stuff around that, and there's some nice work showing how the regular cycles over the course of the week impact on them and how you should extrapolate from the Thursday midnight figure.
Yeah.
And that's another type of variation is of course not random but systematic.
Yeah.
Because of the way we work, we've got these peaks and troughs. We've got patients coming in the morning and then they're being discharged in the afternoon and the evening, coming in Monday, Tuesday, discharges Friday, nothing at the weekend. All of that is actually increasing the standard deviation a lot. So reducing that, lots of stuff about weekend discharging, and aligning the flows in and out is a big piece of work.
Yeah.
Pooling, adjoining wards useful. Yes, so of course, we're thinking about pooling in terms of what is sensible clinically and physically to put together to treat as a pool. And we might have varying degrees of pooling, varying degrees of how hard the wall is between the different parts of the pool that we can flex. And of course, it's easier with bays to think about flexing than it is with a traditional Nightingale type ward. Adapting the GG infinity model to handle time of day. Yes, a big assumption is also that steady state thing. So we could model different times of day with different models, different arrival rates in particular, but we would be having to think about how long does it take to get from one steady state to the next, and does it ever reach that steady state? So again, you could probably get quick snapshot results from modeling what happens in the morning versus what happens in the post-lunchtime crunch, etc., what happens at the weekend. But to get more detailed about those transient periods, then you might be going to simulation, where you can actually say, let's simulate a week with ebbs and flows. Much more laborious, but it depends if you need or you think you need that level of accuracy.
Sure.
Trying to reduce variation. Variation in arrivals, then back to thinking about, well, how do we work? GPs referring in bunches. I don't know, following a morning set of appointments, can we reduce that? The nice, you've probably seen the NHS Quicker thing that they've done in the Southwest, where if you need urgent treatment, you look on your app and it adds together the waiting time in all of the services around you, plus the travel time from Google Maps. And that is doing some smoothing. So if somewhere is unusually busy, they're hoping they're directing patients somewhere else.
Yeah.
In Manchester,
I was going to say we're going to have the that's being presented at Huddle in a couple of Huddles time. So that'd be interesting to see what
the guys at Exeter did some really lovely work.
Yeah, that's it. They want to extend it as well, so it'd be it seems like a good model for people to sort of tap into.
There was an effort in Manchester again some decades ago that the ambulance service wanted to decide where to send a patient. They wanted to be able to direct their ambulances according to how busy hospitals were and inpatients, looking at the bed pools. They wanted to do that, and they did quite a lot of work on that, but it did run into some political issues, as you can imagine. So people have tried things like that. In terms of length of stay, then obviously discharging people earlier in the day, not just in the evening, discharging at the weekend, trying to anticipate someone who's going to be an extra long length of stay and get things lined up. Again, lots of really nice work's been done on trying to bring down those delayed discharges.
Yeah.
And putting patients together. We talked about segmenting by pace. That is a really powerful idea. Putting your not very sick patients in an environment where they're used to quick turnover. The nurses and the staff are used to quick turnover, and thinking about, well, this patient's going to be gone by the end of the week, rather than we wait and see what happens next, and then something else will happen. So they'll be here a month.
Yeah, it's almost a psychological state, isn't it?
Let's
in, out, boom.
Yes,
Sort of thing,
amongst
because
the staff and the patients.
Yeah.
And
I've
the
seen
system's
that.
geared up to get them through.
Yeah.
And then consistency between hospitals by specialties. I don't know much about those sorts of comparisons. I always encourage hospitals to benchmark, in particular, the length of stays against other hospitals. And there are some services that do that, some private services that many trusts were subscribing to, and look around and see if they're managing to get particular types of patients or HRG groups or something through in smaller, significantly smaller length of stay, then what's going on? How are they organizing it differently?
Yeah.
Because length of stay is a really powerful benchmark, I think, about how efficient you are.
Yeah.
And particularly if you can split that up and how much was actually genuine, justified length of stay and how much was delayed discharge, and then why was it delayed?
Absolutely.
Lots of QI work around that. Liberate a lot of capacity, turn the bed into productive capacity rather than storage.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I think we've come to time. Nathan, I think I've made you work really hard. You've answered all the questions, and thank you ever so much for presenting today. Really, really fascinating stuff. Really robust information that people can take away and use in their own organisations, and also that we wish others would use, you know, collectively in different settings as well, because it would be really, really helpful. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you, and you're very useful. And sorry, you're very welcome. You're very useful, because Rachel, you're very welcome.
No, I am very useful. No, you were right first time. Yes, I'm very useful.
And people are welcome to get in touch with me after this if you'd like.
Thank you. No, that's really kind. That's really kind.
The main thing I do, by the way, is run the higher specialist scientific program for trainees. So if you're working in trusts, look round for any HSSTs, because they get a lot of QI stuff and ops stuff from me, and a lot of other great management stuff. So, and many of them are good analysts as well, of course.
That's brilliant. That's
So
brilliant.
they're a good resource.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I've just quickly moved on to, I think I'm still sharing. Yeah, I've moved on just to a quick reminder, like I said at the beginning, if you're, we mentioned this at our last huddle, we're doing some modelling around community services. How easy is that? I mean, whoever's involved with that, they must be thinking, well, wow, this is a doddle. And in relation, especially when you're relating that to what's going on maybe in the changing acute sector. And then I've just got a little bit more about what's coming up. We've got some more demand forecasting, and that's sort of with a focus on executives and professionals. So that's kind of translating that piece for a slightly different audience. We've got NHS Horizons coming along as well. I think that might be in 2 huddles time, and then we've got some various other fascinating huddles for people to look forward to enjoying. And as always, we welcome people coming forward and saying, I've got some stuff I would like to share with you, because we'd be very, very interested to hear more about that. And I know that for a fact, because all of that stuff that you flashed in front of me was really great stuff. So again, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Nathan, for presenting. Really enjoyed that. And we'll see everybody again in a couple of weeks. So bye-bye.